Welcome to the Fair Housing Insiders. We are so thankful that you joined us. And please remember to subscribe here on our YouTube channel or follow and like us on your favorite social media outlet, which you can find links to in our show notes for even more fair housing news and insights. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Fair Housing Insiders, episode 91. Today, we're doing part 4 of our series, Is It a Disability? One of the most watched episodes was episode 40 on hoarding with Mary Ross, and we're so grateful that she was able to be a guest on our show. Today, we're going to focus on whether or not hoarding is a disability. So I'm your host, Jonathan Sarr, and we are joined today by Kathi Williams. So Kathi, we look forward to having your insights on this topic. So let's jump into our scenario, help give us some background for this conversation, and then we have some questions for you, Kathi.
I received a lease violation in the mail today regarding my apartment and balcony. I know I need to clear it off, but I have nowhere else to put it. It's all things that I need, and I just can't see my way of getting rid of any of it. I've been working on getting better organized in my apartment, but as I've told you before, my belongings are important to me. I can't just throw them away.
I'm so sorry, Mrs. Whitney. You seem very distressed about it. But these are our rules, and I think we've been very patient with you, hoping you will correct these violations. So unfortunately, you will need to comply within 30 days to avoid an eviction.
Love the scenario. Excellent. So Kathi, your comments. Is hoarding a disability?
Jonathan, the need to accumulate an unreasonable amount of items in and around a person's home and the inability to reduce the amount of items that they've collected without a lot of, psychological distress is viewed as a mental disability called hoarding disorder. For some individuals, the accumulation of stuff begins after some terribly painful event in their life or because of some other mental illness. So trying to get rid of the stuff gets tied up with all that anguish and upset, which makes getting rid of their possessions nearly impossible for them. As with most mental illnesses, there are various degrees of severity to the behavior and of the kind of different things that get collected in their homes. Obviously, if the resident lives in multifamily rental housing, as they do in our scenario, their behavior often results in serious lease violations. While this is a complicated mental illness, and we could talk about this and the impact on rental housing forever, to save time, the last point I want to make is that it's rare for a person with hoarding disorder to acknowledge their disability and ask for help.
Yeah, thank you for that overview, summary. As you mentioned, it's a big topic, a complicated topic. And it's one that's super important, and it's unfortunate to hear that some have a challenge being able to ask for help, but that's the reality. So that leads to our second question then, Kathi. So is property management required to hear an accommodation request when one isn't explicitly asked for in the case of hoarding?
That's a really relevant question when we talk about hoarding disorder. As most of our audience knows, the general rule is that a resident has to come to management with a request for a reasonable accommodation before management is responsible to make one. There are some exceptions to that general rule, though, and this would be one of those. That's when it is obvious that a person has a mental disability and that that mental disability is probably related to the lease violation, which that's the case when we're talking about hoarding disorder. So if it's obvious to the housing provider that a mental illness is involved, then it should be the responsibility of the housing provider in a very careful way to raise the issue and offer to make a reasonable accommodation for the resident, even when they didn't initiate the request.
Okay. And thank you, Kathi. Lots of sensitivity, again, in that topic itself. So appreciate your direction on that question. So one other question for you then, Kathi. So does the fact that the resident may be disabled mean that management is required to just put up with hoarding behavior?
No, it is not. While sensitivity is required and maybe a lot of patience, the bottom line is people with disabilities don't get to ignore the lease requirements and make lease violations on and on and on. What a housing provider should do when dealing with an obvious mental disability is to offer to work with the resident to cure the violation. So with hoarding disorder, perhaps the housing provider could offer the resident extra time. So even if you've given them another 30 days, maybe give them another 90 days to work with you, the housing provider, to fix the problem. And maybe the problem won't be fixed perfectly, but it will be improved to the point where at least it stops being such a severe problem, especially if there are issues such as odors and sanitary issues that might even affect the residents, other residents. So it depends again on the severity and what's involved. A lot of times we look at a reasonable accommodation with hoarding disorder as a reason to set up an action, what you might call an action plan with the resident, in which a schedule is laid out for how they should correct the problem little by little over a period of time. That is, the schedule set out in the action plan. And then the housing provider follows up regularly to see whether it is being implemented. If not, to encourage the resident to start right away. If it is, to see if they're meeting the deadlines. And also to encourage the resident to bring in a third party, like a family member, a social service agency, to help them, recognizing that sometimes it's almost impossible for them to get rid of their stuff without some direct hands-on assistance. So all of that, if documented, will serve as acknowledgement that you have reasonably accommodated them. And then if nothing works, if it doesn't achieve some level of reasonable condition of their unit and you have to go for termination, you've got a fully documented reasonable accommodation process in your files that in which you can defend against a claim of a fair housing violation.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Kathi. Yeah, such a sensitive topic, one that takes a delicate balance, and I appreciate so much. I know our audience has deeply appreciated your comments and explanation on options that they have in front of them. So thank you again for being on the show. It's been another great topic of Is It a Disability? Today talking about hoarding, episode 91. Thank you, Kathi, for joining us, and thank you to our fair housing community. Until next time, take care, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and we can't wait to hear your feedback about today's episode. Do you have a topic that you would like to see discussed in a future episode? Feel free to share that with us. In the show notes, you'll see a link to sign up for our newsletter. This newsletter will keep you up to date with our latest episodes, blogs, and information about our online fair housing courses. Thank you again, and happy training.